14th District State Representative Chris Corry. He's in the house this morning. Good morning, Mr. Corry.
Good morning. It's good to see you guys in the human form.
Yeah, definitely.
Us would love to shed our alien forms, and here we are. Chris, always fun to talk with you because you tell it like it is.
Yeah, that's right.
We really respect that about you, that you don't play games to secure toe holes and positioning and all that other stuff. We're just kind of talking about that off air, and this isn't your end of your life career dream. You can afford to be honest, and that's what we need, and that's what we expect from you, and so that's one of the reasons that we said let's get Chris in here, because there's a lot of misinformation about what Washington's doing as far as CRT goes and critical race theory, and we're seeing it bubble up all across the country now in some states that are taking preemptive action against it being taught in schools, and we're seeing parents pushing back at school board meetings around the nation, and you guys were involved in a couple, 3 bills that while it maybe never came out in those words, I think came out in that kind of sentiment, but that's for you to explain. So take us in fact, if you want, give us some of the roots of how you see this coming about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think appreciate you guys having me on. First and foremost, I want to make a distinction here. I've been watching the news lately, and a lot of the defenders of critical race theory are using some pretty false arguments, in my opinion. They're coming around and saying, well, we're just teaching history. You just want us not to teach history? Is that what you're saying? And that's, of course, not true at all. And critical race theory is not history. It's got theory written in it. It's clearly different. I grew up in the 80s and 90s.
Whippersnapper.
I know. Sorry, my apologies. Somebody's got to pay your Social Security.
Thank you. Me and my fellow seniors all say.
Sorry, and we've derailed it 1 minute in. No, so, I grew up, as a kid of the 80s and 90s, I grew up full well knowing American history. I knew the good stuff and I knew the bad stuff.
You're one of the lucky ones then, because I bet there are a lot of your peers that don't.
Well, they might not have been paying attention, but
It was taught.
It was taught. I knew about slavery. I knew about the complex history of our founders, that the heirs that they had. I actually spent a lot of my childhood in California, and we learned in California history about, what the Spanish did to local native populations there and stuff like that. And so it was never, I was never painted this picture that America was perfect. And we're having that conversation now, right? Where it seems like, well, we just have never taught history. Well, I'm sure there's certain pieces that we haven't taught, and I'm okay teaching that. But we have to make it clear that critical race theory is not history, and we do not want to conflate the two because it's not healthy. Critical theory is, and I know you've talked about it on this show, is a Marxist idea that seeks to destroy institutions to put in, neo-Marxism, communism, socialism, whatever pretty word we want to paint on it. And that was the intent, right? If you looked back at Marxism and why it never took hold in the West, was because we had a burgeoning middle class, right? You had a capitalist system that brought everyone up, right?
We didn't have the downtrodden lower masses that they did in these other countries.
No.
It looked like the only way out was to overthrow and change systems.
Yeah,
right?
so you really, in that case, the only way Marxism ever really took hold was if you had two social groups, right? The us versus them, and you could pit one versus the other. That never really took hold in the West because we had, people liked their institutions, right? They had a good life for the most part, right? It was never perfect for everyone. You had, a healthy society. You had people that were able to rise up, especially in America, and overcome. They weren't stuck in a particular class. And so it never really took hold. So that neo-Marxism, really starting with Gramsci and those people that picked up the torch, said, okay, so you're not going to get it through this overt political revolution, right? So how do we break this society down? Well, they went in and they turned in and they said, okay, so we're going to take over the institutions. We're going to get this culturally ingrained in us, and then we will go for the political and social movement. And so that's what you've seen, the slow march. And we've, you guys have probably talked about it in the past. I remember seeing bits and pieces of it at the University of Washington, never thinking that it was going to get outside of this academic circle. Right.
Just sort of
that's right.
Sitting around sipping or smoking something and talking about what ifs and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. And basically, tell me if this tracks with what you know. We have replaced the class system of the haves and have-not with the color system, the race system now.
Well, it's the intersectionality system, right? It's not just color, it's not just race, it's gender identity.
True,
it's,
true.
You know, you break those down, you've got this intersectionality, and essentially you pit the oppressors versus the oppressed. And if you are this demographic, you know, according to critical race theory, the three of us as white cisgender males are the oppressors, just by dint of the color of our skin,
Breathing air,
and being a male, right? We have all the markers of being an oppressor. According to
if
critical
I were to run for Miss Nevada, would that still include me in that
Stop
group?
it.
All right, move on.
It.
Oh, I want to make a joke here really bad, but I won't. So, anyways, so you look at that and you see this new, you know, what we're talking about now, this critical race theory, and that's not history. And we got to make it clear that if, you know, some of these things that we're seeing come out of these schools, whether it's in Virginia, you know, some of the curriculum that's coming out, there's been a lot of really good reporting. Especially from City Journal, Chris Rufo. He does a really good job at pulling out like what we're actually teaching. And we're seeing these examples in classrooms of kids being taught as little as first grade that, you know, what are their privileges? What, you know, how are you an oppressor? I mean, what are we doing? We spent, you know, we've shed blood in this country over getting rid of this stuff and getting rid of racism.
Right.
And here we are now fundamentally going back and telling people, you're either, based on the color of your skin, you're in a certain class. And I can't imagine growing up as a person of color being constantly told I'm oppressed and I'm a victim, and what that would do to me as an individual when I'm constantly being told this country is against me. And it's just not true. Do we have a flawed past? Absolutely. But you can't conflate 1865 and 1965 and 2021 and make it sound like we're all the same. We have made so much progress. Are there areas that we need to fix still? Absolutely. But this notion of you are born and without, you know, with no fault of your own, you're an oppressor and oppressed. So what do I say to my adopted son who's Hispanic? Is he an oppressor because he's part of a white family, or is he oppressed because he's Hispanic?
Geez.
Like,
No, he's enjoying your privilege. So ergo, sorry, buddy, even though your genetics and your ethnicity might put you in one category, the fact that he's living with the Corry family, he's an oppressor. I'm sorry.
okay.
Sorry
All
to
right.
tell you
Well,
that.
I will
Write that down.
Let him know.
Let me just interject this. And here's the part of the problem is that this opens the door on the past as well. Driving in this morning, heard about Scottie Pippen of the Bulls talking with sports announcers about back in like 95 or 6 or whatever it was that they were in a playoff game without Michael Jordan, and Phil Jackson drew up the last play, the last shot for Tony Kukoc instead of Scottie Pippen. And now, you know, 25 years later or whatever, Scottie's looking back at that through the prism of race. And Phil Jackson had to have been a racist because he was trying to elevate Kukoc over Scottie, who'd been there with him through ups and downs and ins and outs. Has nothing to do with coaching, making the right play, calling you know, everybody's just going to be expecting Pippen, so he sets it up for Kukoc. And because he did that, he actually said that, you know, that it was because of race. So now we can go back and look at everything that's ever happened and now reposition it as it had to be racism, must have been racism, all the way back. And that's, you know, the whole idea about all this is moving forward, not going backwards.
Well, I mean, you look at cancel culture, right? I mean, we're tearing down statues. We're seeing conversations about people trying, you know, do we need to rename Washington State because George Washington had slaves? Well, yes, he had slaves, but did you ever read any of the history about how he talked about how he didn't like it? Did you ever read the history about, you know, where he talked about how this would be mulled out of our society eventually, that it was not sustainable and conflicted with Christianity? They knew that. It was a tough time, you know, for them. There were supporters back in those days that supported slavery, that thought that was the way to go. But we knew that history had an end date on that. And our founding documents, that's what's so brilliant about our founding documents, is that it was a creedal idea that was not based on dint of your race or your orientation or your gender, that it was eternal truths for every person living on God's earth. And did we fail miserably in the beginning? Absolutely. But the genius is we've been able to go back and fix it.
Some of the great black thinkers in America, the Thomas Sowells and others, will tell you that, you know, our African American communities are better off in America than any place else in the world. It may not be, you know, perfection caught up yet, but still tremendous, as you say, tremendous progress. And some people do see it, but what do they get for bringing that up? You know, they're totally ostracized.
Oh,
They're,
absolutely.
Uncle Tom's. Well, all right. So we have a bit of the history. We know that this is academics. A lot of times there are ivory tower types who think they know a better way, and when, as you say, communism didn't take hold, they started thinking about this sort of stuff, and it seems like it's given George Floyd, given Black Lives Matter, given all the woke thing that's happening. There's just a bunch of things that are all coming together right now to create this opportunity. One of the things that our legislators did was look at this from a couple different ways for Washington and to provide training. So from your perspective, what did you folks do, and what does that mean for students in the Yakima Valley going forward?
So there was a couple bills that passed. There was one addressing, teaching critical race theory to colleges and college students. The one that I think is most pertinent to us here in the Valley was one that would provide critical race theory training for faculty and staff in schools across the state in K-12 system. And the problem there is, we're just continuing on this march of putting more and more state mandates on these local schools, and that's really concerning to me, because we have locally elected and run school boards, and that's the way our school districts should be run, not this top-down approach from OSPI. So this House bill, which passed, obviously I've voted against it, is now mandating that be taught. So there's 2 points to that that I want to make. The first one was we had a Republican amendment from Jim Walsh that basically said, here's what you can't teach. You can't teach that any race is superior to any other race, that any religion. I mean, it just basically went down to the fundamental notion of equality and said you can't teach one person is better than another. And they took that as an offense and spent a couple of hours railing against it, saying how racist it was. And that was unfortunate, because it just simply wasn't true. We were just trying to say, listen, don't start teaching these kids and the faculty and staff that would in turn teach the kids that by dint of the color of their skin, they are either an oppressor or oppressed. That was the big piece. I think the more concerning thing is, okay, so now that that's in law, how is that going to get implemented across our local school districts? We're seeing a lot of pushback. You've seen it in Virginia. You've seen it across the country in Texas. Where people are saying enough is enough, and we're not going to put up with this. So what I would call my action items for family members in this community is, one, be engaged with your school board. Obviously, respectfully, talk to your school board. They are locally elected. They are your representatives, and demand to know what they are approving, and demand to look at the curriculum. Because if they're teaching history, great, have no problem with that. But if they're putting in this other stuff with throughout the day or throughout their curriculum, then you need to either put a stop to it with your school board, or run and replace those that are willing to sit there and engage in this stuff for our kids. Because it's a poison. Critical race theory is a poison. End of story.
We're just teaching history. Well, there is some concern that it will show up in other disciplines, in math, and how what we hear math is racist. Everything that can be cast in that light is.
Yep.
So far as I know, our teachers are mandated a day of training. Is that the physical or the specific limitation of what the bill says? Is that every school teacher will need to have at least a day of training of some kind, and then it's up to the locals to implement what they learned in their training?
What qualifies for it? Yeah, it's basically teachers, staff, administrators. They all have to go through this every year.
Focusing on topics such as diversity, equity, and inclusion.
And how do you, it sounds really good on the surface, right? Of course we want to be diverse. Of course we want to include people. Yeah. But how, that's the issue for me. It's the how we're doing that. Again, I go back to this idea of you're either a victim or you're an oppressor. And that is fundamentally a really terrible way to be brought up, and that will impact you for the rest of your life.
Sure.
If you continually think that you're a victim and everything is set against you. That's one of the great things about America is that hard work and determination can move you, and it's not based on the color of your skin or your gender, but that if you want to work for something, you have the opportunity to do it. Doesn't mean you're going to get it, right?
But that's white supremacist language, according to the National Museum
Yeah,
of
that's
African
right.
Oh, is that
American
coded?
Working hard, yeah.
Working hard, being
Yeah.
responsible, showing
Yeah.
up on time. Those are all racist constructs.
You want to avoid poverty? Those are the things you do.
That's right. Chris, I'm looking at an opinion out of the Tri-City Herald, and it says setting the record straight on critical race theory. They say, contrary to a surge of misinformation online, there's no new law requiring Washington State Public Schools to adopt the controversial critical race theory curriculum. This point needs to be made clear. The law was approved last April by the governor. The legislation, the governor requires a professional training day for school district staff that focuses on topics such as diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Well, that's correct, but what's next?
Yeah.
What's next,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
We're talking about, I think one of our callers, it's semantics here. We're talking about and you voted against ESSB 5044 that made this professional training day a requirement, right?
correct. And it fundamentally comes down to the inherent flaw in critical race theory. For the new listeners, again, that may have just joined us,
Right,
critical race theory is not history. They're very different things. And that they need to be, I cannot, state that point strong enough. No, as of now, there is no direct state mandated teaching in schools, but we do know that schools across the state have started engaging in this and teaching this. As a matter of fact, they've had some stuff on the west side, and that
Right.
is why it is so important that we as parents and as community members engage with our local school boards to make sure that this type of stuff is not brought into our classrooms.
And give me one example where the dialogue about this sort of thing started and then just stopped. You said, "What's next?" And that's the point. There's always a next. There's nobody brings up something and then doesn't start to teach it. Nobody has the training and then closes the book, leaves it on the shelf, and moves on. It's not the way it works. So people who think that you're being alarmist or you're running around with your hair on fire
Well, that's
about,
kind of
oh,
the-
no.
that's
That's
kind-
what the
the
editorial made it
was like,
sound
yeah,
like. For those
yeah.
of you guys are freaking out, it doesn't
Yeah,
say that.
right.
Yeah, but it says enough so that we'll meet you at the freak out, 6 months from now or whenever. But
Yeah,
that's
the point
thing.
is to avoid having to get there, right? I mean, that's
True.
where you need to make sure that you're supporting good candidates for school board. You're focused on curriculum transparency. I'm going to bring it back, if I can, to when we did the comprehensive sex education bill last year.
Yeah. Jeez, we've forgotten about that.
Yeah, well,
That's still being taught.
that's
Jeez.
so you've got
Chris hasn't forgotten about it.
I know.
That's
An
right.
elephant never forgets. So you look at that, and one of the things that I voted no on the bill, obviously fought against it, but one of the things I was able to work with the Democrats and add was transparent curriculum, that curriculum would be available online for them to access anytime. And what we're seeing here is kind of a pushback on that notion of, well, we're the educators, and I'm not saying this is happening in the Yakima Valley, but, we're seeing it's like, well, this is what, as the experts, we've got this curriculum. Well, as a parent, I'm the ultimate expert and responsible person for my child. I want to see what you're teaching them. Partially because we need to know what's being taught. And the second thing is, if you're going to start teaching stuff like this, you're going to have questions at home. And if you're not armed
Dang
with
right.
what's being taught,
Yeah.
you have no way to,
Right.
potentially engage on that. So,
Right.
yeah, maybe the Tri-City Herald, is factually correct, right, in the thing. Is right now we're not teaching that, but we need to be alert to it, and we need to make sure that we, one, arm ourselves with what critical race theory actually is, and make sure that we are engaging with our school boards to stop any, spread of that curriculum into our students' lives. That's the important thing. And so, demanding transparency for the curriculum. If you get pushback on that, you got to wonder what's in it. Why are
Right.
you so afraid of it if
Yes.
it's so good?
It's our tax dollars paying for the whole operation to run and present this information to our kids. And they're graded on this, and their futures are predicated by how well they do in school, et cetera, et cetera. We sure as hell have the right and responsibility to see what that material is.
You know,
Absolutely.
This editorial does say, they say if politicians and others are concerned that ESSB 5044 is the first step toward pushing critical race theory beliefs on school children, well, then that's a more acceptable conversation starter.
Well, that's essentially what we're
That's
talking
it.
about
That's
right
it.
now,
That's
right?
it, exactly.
And if I can, I want to give you an example from California, which it used to be you'd say, well, California. It's like, well, that's crazy, California. Now Washington is like the hold my beer.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
oh, California's doing that. We're going to do it one better.
Yeah.
Every time I'm in Olympia and somebody talks about what California's doing, like it's a good thing, I'm like, no, do the opposite. It's like if you had, if you were the younger brother and your older brother was getting in trouble, you have two choices. It's like, I could either not do that and go a different path, or I could just follow down that path blindly. We're the younger brother to California.
Yeah, good point.
So in Cupertino, California, elementary school forced first graders to deconstruct their racial and sexual identities and rank them according to their power and privilege.
Amazing.
First graders.
Amazing.
First graders. The only thing they should be ranking is their favorite Star Wars characters.
That's right.
Like these kids do not need to be discussing this.
Jeez.
It's not appropriate. And it will continue to, if you continue down this path, it will continue to create and make things worse for these kids. Because again, they're going to see themselves fundamentally as a victim or an oppressor. So you're going to go around with all this guilt that because of the way I was born, I'm this, evil person. Or they're going to go around saying the world is against me. Everybody is, looking to get me. And what is that going to get you? Either of those two extremes are not good for you.
We hear all the time about victim mentality and how that robs you of your initiative. It robs you of your creativity, and it makes you expect the worst and demand more from services. It's just the whole victim thing.
We're stealing people's agency.
Yeah.
That's the one of the things that bothers me the most is that we're telling people they can't without us, right?
Right.
And I speak a lot. Before COVID, I would go visit some high school classrooms, talk about state government, and I would always try to end with, if anybody ever tells you that because of your X, Y, or Z, your skin color, your sexual orientation, your race, that you can't do X without them, run. Because that is fundamentally about power and control.
Yep.
It's not about making them a better person.
And as young as you look, did any of them ask you what you're doing after school when you're done? Does any of that ever happen? Or?
Just ignore what he says.
What? All right, look.
Jealousy's rearing its ugly head. It's okay.
The bottom
Don't forget,
line.
it's old and ugly head. Okay.
As a gentleman of a certain age, right?
Yeah,
right.
Well, now you're part of that consortium, right? As an age, with the age thing.
That's
don't,
right.
Don't you
mess
get
with me, then I got ageist protection. So watch
what
yourself.
color is that on that flag? Does that
Whatever color he
white.
wants it to be.
Gray, I
Gray.
suppose.
Whatever he identifies as.
All right. Well, let's switch gears while we have you here, Mr. Representative, and
Hold
just
on.
ask.
We got one more. We got to do the bottom line thing, Dave. The bottom line thing. Pay attention if you're a parent, right?
Absolutely.
Pay attention
Be engaged.
out there. Be engaged. All right. Move on, Dave.
You shut me down for that? Come on now. Be engaged. All right.
Well, I was gonna further talk about it, but I knew
go
you
ahead.
had
I just thought you
But
might want to.
no,
I thought you might want to talk about
Yes.
we're not at 70%, and where are we at, and how's
Yes,
opening
where
up going to
are
affect
we?
us.
What's
But let's
going
not
on?
talk about that.
No, let's
when
talk
we
the
can
bottom
be
line.
engaged.
Bottom line. Where are we? What have you heard from the governor on COVID?
Oh, well, tomorrow's a big day for him. He's apparently going to be unveiling some banner at the Space Needle and then doing something in Spokane. So he's going to take his victory lap tour tomorrow.
So
we're opening up tomorrow.
we're opening
Like
up
that's-
tomorrow. 'Cause, I mean, we haven't got anything from the governor or anything today.
No, he's got his events planned for tomorrow. He's keeping his emergency order, which I think probably should be the biggest news here, is that we're keeping this emergency proclamation so he can still continue to do whatever he wants. We offered. It's funny. So during session, we offered actually a very good bipartisan compromise that said, okay, we respect the will of the majority. We respect the idea of the governor having these emergency powers. Here's what we'll do for legislative oversight. After, I want to say it was 60 days, the legislature has to come in and vote to approve it. And it doesn't even have to be the entire legislature supermajority. You just had to get 3 of the 4 to agree. So it essentially protected the Democrat power, assuming the majority.
3-minute stations.
But they didn't want it until about 3 weeks after session, when the governor held Pierce County back, and all the Democrats in Pierce County started whining and saying, well, now we're going to come after, and we need some legislative oversight. It's like, well, where were you 3 weeks ago? Where were you for the 105-day session where we were constantly talking about this? And the fact that this was not how these emergency powers were designed to be used. And my bigger fear is, okay, today it's COVID-19. What's the next one?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm surprised he hasn't declared an emergency climate order and just started ripping out carburetors from people's cars. Sorry, that was a little hyperbole, but I mean, that's my fear, and it's not just this governor. It's what's the next governor do? Well, you know, what
and use those emergency powers for whatever else he feels like, right? I mean,
yeah, that's a concern.
Don't forget, you know, the legislature has the ability to call a bill based on an emergency, and then you can't attack it as the citizenry, for a period of time or ever.
So if you add an emergency clause to a bill, it prevents it from going to a referendum.
Right.
So they've done that on several pieces of legislation that they don't want people voting on.
Yeah, there's built-in protections, if you will, within the system to maintain the status quo. Well, Representative Chris Corry, we really appreciate your time, your frankness, your expertise, and your willingness to talk to the peeps. That's the way to do the gig, I think. And
my pleasure.
Always a delight to have you in. More work to do, obviously, as we see where our state gets rolling here, as we bust out of any sort of limitations and fully open up tomorrow and into the future. I look forward to more conversations with you down the road.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Right on.